Hi everybody, Jessica Holloway here from Deakin University. This is the first one of these videos and I hope that I'll have several more at some point. So I hope you'll bear with me as there will likely be a little bit of trial and error involved in figuring out exactly what these videos might be and how they might be used. I initially wanted to make these in case they might be of use while we are practicing social distancing and therefore don't have as much interaction either between supervisors and graduate students or students and teachers or whatever the case may be. So I appreciate you joining me and I hope that you find this useful. And so with that, I'll get started. So today I'm going to be talking about an article that I wrote for the Journal of Education Policy. It was published in 2018 and it was with my colleague Jory Brass. The name of the article is Making Accountable Teachers, the Terrors and Pleasures of Performativity. And I thought for this first video, what I might do is instead of talking about the article itself and what is in the article, because it is available for you to read if you would like, and if you don't have access to it, please feel free to email me for a copy of it. But instead of going through it kind of in a conference presentation type style, I thought I'd actually give you more background information about how the paper came to be and what I kind of now think of a few years on as being some of the biggest takeaways from the article. And then after I do that, I think I'll provide a few potential discussion questions or even some questions maybe for you to consider for your own work. And I'd also like to invite you to ask me some questions as well. So like I said, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how the article came to be, some lessons that I learned along the way, and how it's kind of shaped my thinking since. And this article was written actually based on some of my dissertation work that I did, that I collected in the United States. At the time, I was very much interested in teacher evaluation and accountability and how accountability was shaping teacher practice. This was, I started collecting these data around 2013. So now it's been about 7 years since a lot of these data were collected, even though I'd argue that it's still quite relevant to today. But when I started to collect this data, I was very much interested, like I said, in how teachers were experiencing accountability. So how things like value-added models and rubrics and coaching and regular observation and whatnot was affecting teachers, how they felt about themselves, how they felt about teaching, how it was changing their teaching, and similar kinds of topics. And it was interesting because I had been a teacher. I had been a teacher for 6 years. I was a middle school English and language arts teacher, also in the U.S., and it was kind of at the height of No Child Left Behind being a very strong force in my teaching experience. And I remember being quite resistant might not be the right word, but I wasn't very appreciative of these new types of measures and really kind of hyper-focus on testing and using numbers to make sense of students. And it just didn't sit right with me. I didn't like kind of the competitive nature of it. And this is really what kind of got me into doing the PhD more generally, because I was very interested in kind of looking at this on a broader scale. So when I was crafting my dissertation, I was planning to use discourse analysis, which I ended up doing, but I was interested at the time in doing some critical discourse analysis. And I planned to go talk to teachers, and I guess I went into this study with a lot of assumptions, thinking that, like my own experiences, I would talk to teachers who would be equally unsatisfied with these new measures and policies, and that they would be quite upset about how it was affecting their practice. And the second I started talking to them, I actually found that that was not right at all. Many of them actually really liked the accountability system. They liked the rubrics, they liked the standards, they liked the evaluation instruments, even though liking them might not be the right phrase to use, but what they did express is that they kind of felt that this is just how it is. When you have to measure what teachers do in some capacity, and they need to be held accountable for such measures. And so they were just kind of resigned to the idea that this is just how teaching is these days. And it really sat quite counter to my own experiences and my own feelings about teaching, both from my experiences as a teacher plus all the research that I had started doing as a PhD student. And so I found kind of these very contradictory and conflicting feelings, and I didn't know what to do, because it was quite different from what I planned the dissertation to be like, which is lesson number one. Don't assume what your dissertation should be. That is not the right way to do research. So that was a lesson learned very early. But I talked to my then professor, Dr. Jory Brass. I was taking a course with him, and I was telling him about some of these findings and how I just really didn't quite know how to make sense of them, and how were teachers finding these things okay, and especially when a lot of the research was saying that these things aren't necessarily fair, and then they can be kind of unreliable, and there were a lot of kind of dangers associated with such measures and practices. And so he said, instead of being worried about the contradictions, look for the contradictions and find out what sorts of conditions might be making those contradictions possible. And he suggested some reading that completely changed the dissertation entirely. And he had me read some Nicholas Rose, some Foucault. He had me read Stephen Ball, and this sent me down an entirely different trajectory, which I would argue has kind of paved the way for the rest of my research agenda since then. But it really allowed me to start thinking about what kind of conditions are different now than to when I was a teacher, and what kinds of conditions might be shaping how teachers think, do, practice, and believe about themselves. And that's how this kind of paper came to be. So Jory, when he was a PhD student about 10 years prior to me, he had done a very similar dissertation. There were some very distinct elements of his than from mine. He was talking specifically to English teachers. They were also pre-service teachers, so they were beginning to enter the profession. But my teachers were they kind of ran the gamut. So I had new teachers, I had veteran teachers, I had across subjects, I had middle school. So they were similar age groups, but both from tested content areas and non-tested content areas. So mine were a bit broader in scope, whereas Jory's were a quite concentrated group. But he was also talking to them about, new accountability policies and practices, how it's affecting themselves, how it's affecting their practice, that sort of thing. So very similar in that sense. And so what we did is we used Stephen Ball's The Terrors of Performativity, his paper, which if you haven't read yet, I highly recommend going back and reading that paper before you read ours. But what we did is we used that framework to look at some of the conditions that had changed between his teachers of 10 years prior and my teachers of what was current at the time. So around 2015 is when we started kind of brainstorming this paper. And some of the big things that we found was again just very clear differences in attitudes, but we were less worried about the attitudes of particular teachers, and we were much more interested in the conditions and the types of logics and how those types of things were shaping what was possible for the teachers of my time. And what we found was that rather than accountability being seen as something that was kind of an intrusion and something that affected my professionalism and my judgment, as kind of this outside force changing me, it was actually what was making up teachers. And so we found that the teachers of my time were they were subjected to very different types of conditions. You can look at the types of preparation that they experienced. It was much less the type of apprenticeship that Jory's participants had experienced, and much more of a kind of accountability framed pre-service experience. So many of them had gone to a similar university where the same accountability system that was used in their current school was also in use. And so they were taught that this is how you do teaching. This is how you you know yourself. You know yourself through numbers. You know your students' proficiency levels through numbers. And so rather than it being like this out thing there that was kind of intruding in on their professionalism, it was something that was part of them. It was something that they knew teaching to be. You can also think about the fact that many of these teachers had grown up in schools that were centered on testing and standards. So a lot of that had been normalized for their own experiences. So when they talk about accountability, it's not seen as this thing that needs to necessarily be critiqued. It might be talked about as something that can be made better and can be done, more validly, more reliably, more fairly, which a lot of my participants did indeed say. But the whole notion of accountability being like this intrusion was much different for my participants. It was much more about how they know themselves and who they are. And so we found this to be quite interesting about the state of education and how these conditions are changing at multiple levels. So not just, in classrooms, but also in teacher education programs. And we have since written other papers that were similar to this work that I will possibly be doing follow-up videos to. One of them is a paper that I wrote for the British Journal of Sociology of Education, and that paper talks very specifically about how these sorts of policies and measures have become not only very present in schools, but they've become kind of the new ontological and epistemological ways in which we know our reality, know ourselves, know quality and whatnot. So might be doing a follow-up video with that one. Another paper that you might be interested, if this paper with Jory is interesting to you, that we did for critical studies in education that just came out last year. And that's really focused very specifically on professionalism and the reprofessionalizing of teachers. So I'll try and get those out shortly in case those might be of use to you. But like I said, if you haven't read some of like Stephen Ball's work, specifically the Terrors of Performativity, I highly recommend that you go back and read that before reading our paper. And hopefully that will help both this video and our paper make more sense. And then some of the things that I would like to now hand over to you and for you to think about is in your own experiences, what sorts of conditions do you see as normalizing some of the beliefs and attitudes and ideas that you have, either about teaching, but it can also be about broader societal things as well. Right now, I think we're facing, as you quite clearly know, some global challenges that are rather unprecedented, and it is really forcing us to think about what conditions are present now, what kinds of conditions got us here, and what kind of conditions are we putting into place, and what might that enable in the future. So I think there are a lot of questions right now for students, for teachers, for graduate students, PhD students, academics, all across, to be thinking about what sorts of conditions do we need to be advocating for that are going to make things possible in the future. So I think sometimes we very quickly jump to critiquing people and individuals, and that's kind of where I was coming from when I started my dissertation work and when I started talking to teachers, and it was so different than my own kind of opinion. I remember thinking, wow, these teachers, they must be brainwashed, or what's happened to them, or who's the bad guy that's created these really terrible policies that needs to be blamed and shamed and this sort of thing. And the work with Jory and some of the readings that I did by his encouragement really helped me see that it's actually much less about trying to find power concentrated in individuals and certain institutions, even though that's worthy and important work as well. But I think we need to balance that with also thinking about what kind of discourses and conditions are enabling these sorts of things actually in a way that in some ways makes sense, even if it's bad. What is it that has led to these sorts of things, and how can we critique conditions, and how can we change conditions, rather than think teachers just don't understand if we just teach them more, if we just we give them a bit more knowledge, or we just show them, we're trying to enlighten them from the dangers of current conditions. That's not really really, I think that critique isn't always helpful in the ways that we intend it to be. So really thinking more about how do we articulate better conditions? How do we change conditions, and where does that need to take place? It's not just in schools; it's in colleges of teacher education, it's in higher education institutions, it's in our research, it's in all sorts of areas that we can think about that are far from just policymakers and institutions. So that's what I'm asking you to think about now. What sorts of conditions have gotten you to where you are and the way you think about things? Also, what kind of conditions are in place in schools? There's a lot of work right now around datafication, data use. I've also done a little bit of writing on that I'd be happy to share, but I think that there are some really excellent works out there that are helping us understand how datafication is changing the way we think and know things, and I think that would be a really interesting area to potentially consider further. But then also, what kind of conditions do we want for the future? So I hope that leaves you with enough to think about for now. If you do have follow-up questions for me regarding the paper, regarding whatever, I would be very, very happy to either do a follow-up kind of Q&A video or chat via email if you want to send me an email. I'll leave my email address in the description of the video. You can also find it at Deakin University's website, so whatever is easiest for you. But I hope to hear from you. I hope this was useful, and yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.